Good afternoon. It's lovely to see you. It's lovely to be back in Oxford because I, believe it or not, was a student here myself 25 years ago, before probably any of you were born, which makes me feel really ancient. So thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak this lunchtime. I remember when I arrived in 1998 as a student at Brierley College, arriving with a Christian faith, but actually, in the process over the 3 years at Oxford, really having that faith challenged and questioned in all kinds of ways, meeting some wonderful non-Christian friends who really challenged me in my own views. And it's just the most extraordinary time, actually, these 3 years, and I just encourage you to cherish it and to take that opportunity it gives you to think through the big questions, because I think this is just such an amazing opportunity. What did I do after I left Oxford? Well, I started in radio journalism, I started in broadcasting, and one of the first things I did was, a few years into that, start a show bringing Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate. It's called Unbelievable. That's a picture of me in studio. And I was really just interested in having conversations around faith and asking, does it make sense to be a Christian? And today, the title of my talk is it rational to believe in God? That's kind of the question we were asking throughout the time that I was host of Unbelievable. The format was simply, week to week, bringing Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate, because I think that's one of the best ways to get to the heart of the truth of whether or not it makes sense to believe. In that particular picture, the person closest to the screen is Andrew Copson. Funnily enough, we were both at Oxford at the same time at Brierley College, but he went on to become the president today of Humanists UK, so very much an atheist, secular outlook on life. And he's in conversation there with a theologian called Theo Hobson. But we've also, as well as radio and podcasting, these shows, we've also had a video channel for a number of years. It's quite a famous character on the right of the screen there, Jordan Peterson, opposite Susan Blackmore, an atheist psychologist, debating can we make sense of life without God. So it's been an amazing journey to be able to host these conversations with all kinds of interesting thinkers across the spectrum, on video, also in lockdown, of course, going to my home studio as well, doing ethical debates, asking, things, questions around assisted suicide, or even quite esoteric issues like psychedelic drugs. There's all kinds of things, and it's been fun to be at the centre of these conversations, asking, what does Christianity have to say to these? Is Christianity believable in the first place? And, of course, I've got onto TikTok as well. So you can follow me there if you want to see some short-form thoughts about God and Christianity and faith and that kind of thing. I'm at Justin.Brierley. But whether it's these long-form or short-form ways of engaging the culture, I guess you could sum up what I've been trying to do as something that's already spelled out in the pages of the New Testament. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, it says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. And trying to engage the big questions, but doing it with gentleness and respect, bringing both sides on to have a fair say, a platform where we can engage and have hopefully a fruitful civil dialogue. That's really been what I feel is the best way, actually, of getting to truth in the end. Some of you may recognise this person, another Oxford alumni, Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a biologist by background, but probably in the early 2000s really became best known as spearheading a movement known as the New Atheism. A very sort of more dogmatic, arguably fundamentalist form of non-belief. Not just saying God doesn't exist, but that religion is evil. And so many of my early shows, especially, because the New Atheism was just kind of building up a head of steam at the time I launched the Unbelievable show, a lot of them were responding to people like Richard Dawkins and his case against God. And I suppose he and many others like him were really putting it in the public square, this question of, is it rational to believe in God? And their answer was clearly no. His best-selling book was called The God Delusion. That's a pretty clear statement of where he falls on that question of whether it's rational to believe in God. And I think sometimes it is difficult for many people of faith to put their case because they haven't necessarily engaged the rational case for Christianity or God. And in many ways, when I arrived at Oxford, I had I guess I'd grown up in church and I'd had an experience that I would say was of God that convinced me that Christianity was true. But when I met sceptical friends at Oxford, they often said, well, look, Justin, I haven't had your experience. Is there anything else you can show me that makes sense of this belief in God? And that was really when I kind of started to encounter what is sometimes technically called apologetics. It's kind of the intellectual case for faith. And as I went on to do the Unbelievable show, over the years, I learned that it's not necessarily that, there's some kind of cast iron arguments for God that cannot be refuted. It's that actually we all come to life with a particular way of looking at the world, a worldview. And what I realised is, most of the time, all we can really do is ask, well, what makes best sense of the evidence around me? Because sometimes when I was encountering some atheists, perhaps, if I'm the atheist over here, they were saying, well, look, Justin, you're the one who believes in all the strange things about the supernatural, God, angels, heaven, that kind of thing. I'm just here as a very neutral observer. You're the one who has to convince me about all these strange beliefs that you have. And I realised actually that's not quite true, because even the atheist is usually coming from a particular perspective. They've got a set of beliefs about the way the world is as well. And the vast majority of the atheists that I met on my show are actually what you might call naturalists or materialists, people who believe that all that ultimately exists is matter in motion, the physical laws of the universe, that's ultimately what everything can be reduced to. Now, that is a very interesting perspective to hold. But it is a position of where you're looking at the world in a certain way. It's not that you're a completely neutral person. You have a particular way of looking at the world and beliefs about the way the world is. And I realised that rather than me standing over here as a Christian and having to defend all of my beliefs, actually, it was just as important that I asked the atheist naturalist, well, why do you believe what you believe? What's your evidence for the way you look at the world? And I found that as I did that, I realised actually there are lots of things that we can agree on out there about the universe, about our experience of life. And the question is, which of these two worldviews best explains them? Which fits best with all of the data we're looking at? And as I looked into it for myself, I found that actually Christianity, the view that there is a God behind the universe, and that God has become known to us in person through Jesus, I think it makes better sense of a fuller set of the data. Doesn't mean there are no questions and no mysteries and things, but I just felt that it offered more answers than the naturalist perspective. And so today what I want to do is, as it says on the slide, give 3 reasons why I believe God is a better explanation than the atheist naturalist perspective, and therefore why it is rational to believe in God. The first area that I want to just come up with is that I think God makes best sense of human existence. One of the first things I ran into as I started my Unbelievable show was lots of people claiming that science disproves God, that the more we know about the natural world, the less reason we have to believe in God. But as I continued to engage some of the leading Christians and atheists in the scientific world, I realised that's not the full story. In fact, I would argue that if the direction of evidence has been going anywhere in the last 100 or so years, I think science, the advance of science, has actually opened up some pretty interesting questions about God. One of the most interesting things I learned early on was an extraordinary phenomenon known as the fine-tuning of the universe for life. Some of you may have heard of this, but it is a kind of slightly, unless you're a physicist, maybe difficult to get your head around. So I came up several years ago with a kind of brief video trying to give a sense of what this is and the extraordinary fact that humans exist at all in this universe. So I'm going to, just for a little while, if we've got the volume up, let the video do the talking.
Some people say that human existence is a result of a roll of the cosmic dice. Like the gambler who stakes his life savings on the next throw, we just got lucky in the lottery of life. Some people say there's no purpose in the universe, no grand plan, no God behind it all. Our numbers just came up and here we are. But I don't believe them, and nor should you. If I roll this dice, the chances of getting a 6 is 1 in 6. That's not too bad. But what are the chances of me rolling 6 twice in a row? Well, the odds get longer. It's 1 in 6 times by 1 in 6. That's 1 in 36. So I'd have to be pretty lucky to get 2 6s in a row. Now, every time I add the chances of rolling another 6 in a row, the odds go up exponentially, and it gets even more unlikely. Now, what if I rolled this dice 70 times, and every single time I got a 6? Okay, that's pretty unlikely, but it's possible, right? Well, in fact, the chances of rolling a 6 70 times in a row are around 1 in 10 to the 55. That's a 1 with 55 zeros after it. Now, just to put that in perspective, how long would I have to stand here rolling this dice, allowing about 5 seconds per roll, before hitting that lucky streak and rolling 76s in a row? Well, I had a mathematician friend work it out for me. On average, you would have to continually roll this dice for 100 trillion, 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 trillion years before your numbers come up. That's a long time. What if you applied that thinking to us? What are the odds of us being here? Now, the odds of rolling 76s in a row, 1 in 10 to the 55, as it happens, those are the same odds of something called the expansion rate of the universe being just right for the existence of us here today. From the moment of the Big Bang, when our universe began to rapidly expand, the rate of that expansion was exquisitely finely balanced. Any faster, and the universe would have expanded too rapidly to allow the formation of chemicals, atoms, stars, and galaxies. Any slower, and the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. But as it happens, the universe expanded at just the right rate to allow for life to develop in the future, for us to be here. It hit 70 rolls of the number 6 in a row, first time. And the expansion rate of the universe is just one among 30 or so other incredibly sensitively finely tuned constants and fundamental forces in the universe that must be just the way they are for the universe to be able to produce us. So let's imagine, if I went ahead and rolled this dice 70 times, and what do you know, every time it came up 6. No waiting for trillions upon trillions of years, first time. Beginner's luck? Hardly. You would assume that I must have rigged it. Maybe the dice are loaded, maybe there are 6s on every side. It can't be chance. Now let me ask you, why would we assume that this universe with us in it, which is actually way more improbable than my 70 rolls, is just a result of chance? The fact that we're here shows that someone's loaded the dice. In fact, maybe there's no dice at all. What if the evidence points to this life-permitting universe actually being the product of an intelligent mind which intended for us to be here? Now, you could come up with some speculative other theory. Maybe there's an infinite number of universes, giving you an infinite number of chances to roll the dice. Maybe. But we don't have any scientific evidence for it. So if you're hanging your hat on that possibility, then you're every bit as much committed to a faith position as the person who says God was behind it. Believing in God isn't a delusion. It's a perfectly reasonable conclusion when we look at the fingerprints on our universe. And if it's true that we aren't just the fluke result of a cosmic roll of the dice, and that we're actually here because a grand designer intended us from the very beginning, well, that's worth staking something on.
Tom, and we got there in the end. But it is an extraordinary phenomenon. In fact, physicist Fred Hoyle, when this phenomenon of the fine-tuning of the universe was just beginning to be explored in the 1950s, said a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking of in nature. But this is just one of a number of aspects of our universe that I think point beyond itself and requires us to think bigger questions than just, well, the universe just happens to be here and that's all there is to it. And the fact that we are here within that universe raises all kinds of interesting questions. The fact that the universe itself, as I mentioned, has a beginning in time and space some 14 billion years ago. The fact that life itself is written in what looks like a code, a language. These are aspects of our existence that I think are crying out for an explanation, that are not readily answered by the naturalist perspective, in which the fact that we're here is just a cosmic coincidence, a fluke. But when you look at the odds, when you look at what it took for us to be here, I'm not satisfied with that answer. It makes far more sense to see aspects of these areas where the progress of science is revealing to us just what it took for us to be here as more consistent with the view that there is a God, there is a divine mind behind the universe that intended for us to be here. So that's why I say that the existence of humans fits better, makes better sense if there is a God. Next area. Here we go. God makes sense of human existence, but I also believe God makes sense of human value. There's a story from 1973 of a wealthy businessman, James Jaramillo, and he was walking along the streets of Bogota in Colombia, and he saw a girl climbing down through a manhole into the sewers below. Well, James was fascinated. He went home, put on a wetsuit and went down into those sewers. And underneath the streets of the city, he found hundreds of street kids living in these filthy, rat-infested sewers. And the reason they were there was that off-duty police officers on the streets above were killing these kids if they found them, these street kids wandering the streets. One officer said, killing these kids is like killing lice. We call them the disposables. Well, since then, James has gone on to rescue hundreds of street kids. He's created special schools and community houses where they can be put into a loving family and community, receive an education, and transforms their lives. But it does raise the question, that story, why did James do the right thing, the human thing? Why do we believe those police officers were doing the wrong thing? And again, for me, the fact is on atheism, on a naturalistic account of reality, it's very hard to account for why we can say that one way of looking at human life, human value, human dignity is right, and another one is wrong. You see, if one culture does develop a disregard for certain forms of human life, be they street kids or girls who are born who aren't particularly wanted in that culture, then if they decide they're disposable, well, that's just the way the world is. If ultimately life, culture, society is based purely on the physical outworkings of a physical universe, then if that's the way one culture develops, that's just the way their morality is. But none of us really feel that way, do we, about life? One of the stories I tell in the book I wrote about sort of my case for faith, called Unbelievable, is an encounter I had with Richard Dawkins here at Oxford University. He had just finished having a really interesting debate with John Lennox, who's a well-known professor of science and mathematics, emeritus professor here at the university. And afterwards I managed to get a quick interview with Richard Dawkins, probably the best known atheist in the world. And we had this conversation. I said to him, but if we'd evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine? And he said, well, I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine, where selfishness, failure to pay your debts, failure to reciprocate favours is regarded askance. That is the society in which we live. I'm very glad, though that's a value judgment, glad that I live in such a society. And I said, but when you make a value judgment, don't you yourself immediately step outside of this evolutionary process and say the reason this is good is that it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement? And he replied, well, my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past. And I said, so therefore it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution. He said, you could say that, but in any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there's anything supernatural going on. And I said, okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact you've developed 5 fingers rather than 6. And he said, you could say that, yes. And I think you could say that, and I think probably you should say that if you are a thoroughgoing naturalist atheist. Because ultimately, on that view of the world, morality simply is whatever the happenstance of the evolutionary socio-cultural milieu happens to produce in your particular sphere of time and place. But none of us actually want to believe that, do we? That whether you believe rape is right or wrong, whether you believe slavery is right or wrong, whether you believe racism is right or wrong, is just purely the happenstance of where you happen to have landed up in your particular socio-evolutionary time and place. Most of us believe actually some things are really right and some things are really wrong, and that's just the case. And people who didn't believe it at one time in history were mistaken. We know better now. But the only way you can believe that there is a real human value, dignity, that it exists independent of what other people think, that only makes sense to me if there is actually a God who kind of grounds that belief in the idea of morality, human rights, value, dignity. Otherwise, it really is just a matter of opinion. It's personal preferences. There's nothing particularly right or wrong about those. For me, the fact that we really do believe in human rights, that we really do believe actually that street kids in Bogota matter just as much as a millionaire in their penthouse, that's got something to do with the fact that from page 1 of the Bible, it says that humans are made in the image of God. If that's true, then it gives humans inestimable value. One of the children in Bogota, when they were found gunned down, had a note pinned to them. It said, "I killed you because you had no education and no future." And the question is, well, is that the measure of a human life? Is it dependent on who we are and where we're born? Is it dependent on our level of education? Or is it dependent on something that transcends all that? Is it dependent on the fact that we're made in the image of God? Again, I find that the Christian explanation of reality, those moral instincts we have, makes more sense than an atheistic understanding of why we believe in the dignity and value of human beings. One final point why I think God makes better sense, and that is, I think God makes sense of human purpose. I want to show you a picture of a full winder. She's got a fascinating story. She's now a stand-up comedian, actually, but at one time she was a very committed atheist. She grew up in a family where she says religion was never on the table. In fact, it was seen as very much a fairy tale. Her bedtime reading was Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and she grew up into her adult years very convinced that life is ultimately explicable in terms of blind forces of nature, atoms, electrons, and the forces of the universe. However, it was shortly after the birth of her first child that Jennifer experienced a dramatic shift in her thinking. This is the way she put it. She said, "I looked down and thought, what is this baby? And I thought, well, from a purely atheist, materialist perspective, he is a randomly evolved collection of chemical reactions. And I realised, if that's true, then all the love that I feel for him is nothing more than chemical reactions in our brain." And I looked down at him and I thought, that's not true. That's not the truth. And this moment was a turning point for Jennifer. It set her off on a journey in the end towards Christian faith. But I think what she realised in that moment is that atheism and Christianity, they are telling two very different stories of reality. Again, Richard Dawkins has summarised this very neatly from the atheist perspective. He says, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." And I think he's absolutely right. If there is no God, that is the universe we should expect to see. The problem is, I don't see a universe like that at all. I see a universe that is teeming with purpose and meaning, with right and wrong, with beauty, with love. And maybe it's just about where you're standing ultimately. Because I find that when I look at the universe, and when I look at us, I see this kind of search for meaning, for purpose, across all times and places and cultures. It's a yearning for something beyond just this physical existence. And I think that itself points to something beyond the universe, beyond just physical life. I think it points to the fact that we're made for more than just reproduction and getting to the top of the biological ladder. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, "A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. People feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. And he said, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. It's sometimes called the argument from desire. But it's that idea, could that human-wide search for the transcendent, for meaning, for purpose, could it be pointing to something beyond itself? Could it be there's something that actually satisfies it? In the way that all our other desires are satisfied by something real, could there be something real that satisfies that ultimate desire for something more? And I think there is. I think that it makes sense to believe in God, to believe that we're not just being tricked by a kind of, a trick of nature, essentially, that makes us want to believe there's more. I think there is actually something at the end of that search. I think the human desire for there to be an ultimate meaning, an ultimate hope, is actually answered in Christianity, and just doesn't really have a satisfactory answer on the atheist naturalist perspective. In fact, I believe that it's in the Christian faith that we see an answer to the deepest longings of our soul. The psychologists tell us that there are two fundamental things people need to be able to flourish. They need love and they need hope. I don't see either of those ultimately as being available on the naturalistic, atheistic view of life. The fact is, we're living in a dying universe, if that's all there is. One day, in trillions of years' time, all that will be left is a cold, sterile void as we head towards the heat death of the universe. All of our self-made purposes and longings and meanings, they'll all be gone and evaporated. That doesn't sit right with me. But in Christianity, there is such a thing as love, there is such a thing as hope, because it's in the person of Jesus that we see love at its most extraordinary demonstrated for us. The idea that God would come in person and give himself, die a slave's death on a cross, to bring people back to himself. That is the most extraordinary act of love that I can think of. And hope is held out as well, because the other half of that story is that there was a life beyond the grave, that through his resurrection, Jesus invites us all into eternal life, into something that makes sense of the life we have now. None of this is to in any way downplay the fact that my atheist friends over the years have important questions, important objections, that they're on a search for truth. But I do find that we come to very different conclusions about where the evidence points. I find it very hard to believe that the rational and ordered universe that we find ourselves in came from nowhere and is heading nowhere. I find it impossible to conceive that our intrinsic beliefs about human value and dignity are in the end just an illusion. And I can't convince myself that global search for purpose and meaning is ultimately in vain. To me, it makes far more sense to read the fingerprints of God out there on the universe around us and in here in our deepest longings and desires. That's why I ultimately believe it is perfectly rational to believe in God. And I would invite you to explore that question yourself. If this is something that's helped you to think through these issues, I'd be delighted. I've got just a few copies of my book if you want to take one with you. They're freely available. Just give them away on a first come, first served basis. But these are the biggest questions we can ask ourselves. This is a wonderful opportunity, these years you have in Oxford, to ask them. And I believe that when we look at the evidence and we ask ourselves honestly what makes best sense, I think the case for God, the case for the Christian God, makes ultimate sense, makes sense of the data around us and some of the deepest longings of our hearts. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll be happy to take some questions. Thank you.